Okay, good morning. This is official. We're going to start. My name is Bill Martin, and I have the pleasure of directing the drug policy program here at the Baker Institute, and welcome you to the Institute. Also welcome you on behalf of Ambassador Edward Jerigian, who's sorry he couldn't be here since it was he who formulated the title for our conference, "The War on Drugs Has Failed. Is Legalization the Answer?" I'm sure that no one here doubts that drugs, explicitly including alcohol, can cause enormous harm. It can ruin the lives of those who use them and those whose lives they affect. They are implicated in a wide range of crimes and are associated with activities that enrich criminals, endanger innocent citizens of numerous countries, involve and fund terrorism, and threaten or seriously undercut the development and practice of democracy. But there's considerable disagreement over the nature and extent of those harms, the factors that contribute to its many facets, and the best ways to go about addressing the many issues that gather under the umbrella of what we call the drug problem. For more than a century, U.S. drug policy has been based on the concept of prohibition, on the desire for a drug-free America with zero tolerance for drug producers, traffickers, and users. For the past 40 years, it has been known as the war on drugs. It is truly a war, with all the hallmarks of war: displaced populations, disrupted economies, excessive violence, terrorism, the use of military force, the curtailment of civil liberties, and the demonizing of enemies. And like other wars we've been engaged in over this same period, victory has been elusive. In fact, many people argue, many people here today, that our policies of criminalization, which include crop eradication, interdiction, and incarceration, not only fail to affect the supply of drugs, they greatly exacerbate the problem. We do not live in a drug-free America. We never have, and we never will. In addition to the legal pharmacopoeia, which runs from OxyContin, Vicodin, Xanax, Prozac, Ritalin, Lunesta, Cialis, Lamisil, a really scary drug, and 5-hour energy drink, to alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine, illicit drugs are used in various combinations by huge numbers of citizens. Today, from a number of angles, we want to explore the wisdom, efficacy, economic sense, and justice of policies that prohibit some drugs and punish their use quite harshly, while allowing other drugs of equal or greater potential danger to be regulated, legally sold, and aggressively marketed. Because, as you can see, we have a packed schedule, I've asked all participants to stay within their suggested time limits for their presentations to allow time for discussion between and among them. We're not going to have oral Q&A today. If there's time, we may ask some of our speakers to respond to some questions that mainly we're going to have them talk to each other. But also because of time pressure, I'm not going to spend much time introducing speakers. Your program includes relevant details about each speaker, and I'm confident that virtually every one of you reads at least grade level or above. I think you'll see that we have an extraordinary aggregation of experts. Some of us even have PhDs, which means we know what's good for people. And I think our time will be better spent listening to our speakers than to hear me go on at length about their achievements. Our opening session this morning on examining the premise, framing the issues, features Ethan Nadelmann, the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance and widely recognized as a leading voice calling for reform of U.S. drug policies. He's currently also working at high levels with government leaders in Mexico, Central, and South America regarding their drug policies. Speaking after him, with the opportunity to respond to points with which he disagrees, is John Coleman, a man of long high-level experience with the Drug Enforcement Administration and president of Drug Watch International. And he, of course, is, like other speakers, free to challenge the premise of the conference that the drug war has failed. Each of them will speak about 20 minutes, then use the remaining time to to converse with each other. So first, I welcome Ethan Nadelmann.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bill. And it's great. This is the second such conference that Bill Martin has organized at the Baker Institute. The last one was also a wonderful gathering. And it's good to know also that the leadership within the organization here is supportive of this sort of debate deep in the heart of Texas. So the question, is legalization the answer? Sort of, yeah, maybe, a bit. Depends what you mean. That's my answer. I should start off right off the bat by saying that I am not a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian. Right? I'm not Milton Friedman's intellectual godson, although I have enormous respect for the principles and the analysis that he provided. And therefore, I don't think that this is a simple solution. And I'm not here to say that the right approach is to simply treat all drugs like alcohol and cigarettes, to make them all legally available, produce, tax, control, regulate them. It's a possibility that that might be the optimal solution, but I don't have the conviction to say that's the answer. Right? I mean, we do know that that would have a lot of benefits. But I think what I want to do, and you know, John and I were just, I should say, by the way, John Coleman and I have known each other for a long time, and we've debated many times over the years, and there are few people I've more enjoyed mixing it up with than John, because he is a gentleman, and I respect the role he played at DEA as head of operations. And so I thought in that spirit, to sort of really frame this not as the kind of ping-pong debate, which still lays out there, but really in terms of a more sort of nuanced understanding of what this debate is really about. And so this is what I want to lay on you. And in the context of that, talk about where I and my organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, would like this thing to move and how we think about it in our own internal discussions and debates. So I think the best way to think about this is to think about drug policy, the various ways of dealing with the reality of drugs in our society, as a set of options arrayed along a spectrum. Right? From the most punitive policies on the one hand to the most free market on the other hand, from Singapore and some parts of Asia and America where it's kind of, you know, lock them up, punish them, drug test them, execute them, you know, no tolerance for nothing, whatever, right? Down to, let's call it the free market, Milton Friedman's wet dream, right? I mean, you know, no controls, not even really much in the way of regulation, but basically no controls except for access to kids. I mean, that's where I mean, in the conversations I used to have with him before he died, that's where he would put it. And that, or you think about, for example, the example of that would be our policies with respect to cigarettes in the 1950s or 60s, right? Low tax, almost no regulations. Now, along that spectrum, right, what do we know? We know that when you deal with something like the legal drugs, alcohol and cigarettes, we have a problem here, which is massive levels of addiction, abuse, the harm to society, the cost, the accidents, all of those things. And some of that is a result of the fact that they are legal and therefore cheaper and more available. Some of that is a result of the fact that they have been woven into Western culture and society for hundreds, if not, well, tobacco for hundreds of years, alcohol for thousands of years. They have been the devil we know. And even when alcohol was illegal and the other drugs were legal, going back 70, 80 years ago, alcohol was still the most popular. So, you know, alcohol's widespread use and abuse is not just a result of its being legal, it's also of its, you know, popularity, its relationship, bad and good to humankind for a very long time. And cigarettes, of course, you know, part of its distinctiveness is its remarkable addictiveness. You know, these surveys where they ask heroin addicts, what's the toughest drug to quit? And always consistently, the heroin addicts will say cigarettes. Much harder to quit than heroin, right? Cigarettes, I hate cigarettes. I mean, I don't want to criminalize them, but I hate them. I think they're devastating, highly addictive. So when we look at the massive levels of use and abuse over here, what we know is that some of it's about their being cheap and legal, but there's a lot of other variables, including addiction, what have you, that also explains it, right? We also know that by doing things like increasing taxations and regulations and bans on consumption where you can take it, that you actually can reduce the consumption of these things and the misuse of these things. And we've seen a lot of that. We've seen dramatic drops in the incidence of cigarette smoking in the U.S. and many other countries, et cetera, et cetera. Now, take, on the other hand, you know, the draconian policies you see in Asia, in many parts of the United States. You know, I mean, we know the problems there. We know the problems of, even though when you prohibit something that viciously, you're still left with high levels of use. We see that there are countries like the United States with very tough drug laws and very high levels of use, and there are other countries around the world that have much lower levels of use, some with tough laws, some with easy laws, right? The best evidence, a good book by Reuter and McCune called Drug War Heresy, shows that essentially there's not much of a relationship between the harshness of the law and the levels of drug use. That the levels of drug use has a lot more to do with culture and other variables like that. But we know what stems over here. We know that when you have this policy of punitive prohibition, you get the crime, the violence, the corruption, the degradation of society, the drug dealers, the bootleggers, the overfilling jails and prison cells. You get the adulterated drugs. You get the things of the spreading of HIV/AIDS. You get the drugs becoming more potent and more dangerous because smugglers don't want to smuggle bulky drugs like opium or coca. They want to smuggle very compact drugs like hard liquor or crack cocaine or things that are, they're just trying to think, how do they efficiently operate as drug smugglers? You look at what's happening in Mexico with 50,000 dead in these drug wars, and you look at the drug dealers taking over parts of territory in many countries now, in South America, in Central America, Mexico, in parts of West Africa now, in Afghanistan, what have you. We're talking about a global black market in drugs worth $300 to $400 billion a year, according to the United Nations. The single most ready source of capital for organized and unorganized criminals, apolitical and political terrorists and criminals, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about when you want to make your money illegally, there's a lot of things you can get into, but nothing gives you the return that does. And what you also see, is that every time we have a success somewhere, the old push-down, pop-up phenomenon. Push-down in Colombia, pops up in Central America. Push-down there, pops up in the Caribbean. Push-down in Southwest Asia, pops up in Southeast Asia, right? What we're talking about here, am I talking too fast, by the way? I am from New York. Too loud? Too loud?
You
just don't want
slowly, but we can listen fast.
You just don't want anybody to hear me, John. That's it. But really what we're talking about here is a global commodities market. With marijuana, cocaine, heroin, these other substances, these are global commodities markets, right? Like coffee, like sugar, like alcohol, like cigarettes, like precious metals, like food products, these are global commodities markets. So long as there is a demand, there will be a supply. And the bigger choice we have as a nation and as a global society is, are we going to find sensible ways to try to regulate this stuff or not? Do we think that we need, for moralistic reasons or other reasons, to continue with a prohibitionist strategy, notwithstanding the obvious costs and negative consequences? Or do we have the guts and intellectual integrity to move in a new direction? Now, the reason I laid out that spectrum is to say we don't go from here to here, from total prohibition to total legalization. First of all, politically, it's never going to happen. There is no 18th Amendment of drug prohibition to be repealed by a 21st Amendment. There is no Berlin Wall of drug prohibition that's just going to be torn down and all of a sudden we'll have a transformation. It's not going to happen. These laws, these prohibitionist laws, are embedded in 100 years of federal, state, and international laws and personal psyches and culture and fears and race and all of these things, right? It's not. It has to be unraveled and transformed. The other thing, of course, is to go from here to there. Not only is it politically unrealistic, but there's not much support over there. I mean, 50% of Americans may now say it's time to legalize marijuana, but when it comes to the other drugs, you have maybe 15%. Some polls will show a little more, a little less, but I don't see it happening anywhere. A country like Netherlands, right, where marijuana has been semi-legal for decades, you don't have huge support for legalizing heroin and cocaine in the same way. So there's a distinction between these things. But I think what the objective is to find the balance on this spectrum, right, which best accomplishes two goals. My definition of the optimal drug policy is the one which most successfully does two things. It's the one which most successfully reduces the harms of drugs, the death, the disease, the crime, the suffering, the devastation to individuals, families, and communities, reducing the harms of drugs, the number of people overdosing, the number of people dying, the number of people getting HIV and Hep C, all of the number of people involved in crime. That's first. And then there's a second objective, which is to reduce the negative consequences of our government policies, of our prohibitionist policies, to reduce the crime, the violence, the corruption, the empowerment of gangsters, the black markets, the overflowing jails and prisons, to reduce the violations of civil liberties and human rights, to reduce the way the distorted role models we provide for young people growing up in inner cities. The best drug policy is the one that reduces the harms of drugs and the harms of drug control policies. That mix is what we're aiming for. Now, where on this spectrum do we best accomplish this? Where on that spectrum? And I would say the objective is to move things down the spectrum to the point where we get not there at the other end, but someplace in here. Let me show you. So if we're over here, here's Singapore way out there. In Singapore, they have lower levels of drug use, but they got a growing drug abuse problem, even with all their caning, whipping, and executing going on, right? The other Asian countries, you look at Malaysia and Vietnam and Indonesia and all these other places, which also were following the Singapore model. And you know what happened? They started developing rising drug problems as well, notwithstanding that model. And then they started to worry about HIV. And so in the last 5-6 years, you have Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Iran, all setting up like needle exchange programs and methadone maintenance programs, things that were inconceivable 10 years ago because they know they have to stop HIV/AIDS, and they're freaked out about that. So you begin to see some modification here. Then you look in the United States where, less than 5% of the world's population, almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We've gone from 50,000 people behind bars on drug charges 30 years ago to 500,000 people behind bars on drug charges today. The racial element of this thing is absolutely extraordinary. We're locking up black people apartheid South Africa looks like nothing compared to the way we lock up black people in America. Our rate of incarcerating black people in America far exceeds the rate of incarceration of the Soviet gulags in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? So we have a monstrous policy here. Now, what is beginning to happen, though, is we see the movements towards reducing prison population. After 30 years of growing our prison population from 500,000 people in 1980 to 2.4 million people last year, it's finally beginning to come down. And even states like Texas, believe it or not, are showing innovative approaches to finding alternatives to incarceration. Texas went through this prison binge. It was like Stalin was in charge or something. Locked up people in horrendous numbers in the 90s and the early part of the last decade. But you see the alternatives emerging, the effort to reduce it, to find alternatives to incarceration. Then you begin to move further down the spectrum. And here's where you get into kind of the European policies. You look, for example, what the Dutch pioneered, of allowing marijuana to be sold through quote-unquote coffee shops, right? Now there's a conservative government that's kind of going back the other way a bit under pressure from its neighboring governments, and they're saying foreigners can't go to the coffee shops anymore, especially in the border towns. But by and large, that Dutch policy looks fairly well stabilized. And even though nobody gets busted for marijuana, right? If you sell to underage kids, you get your shop closed down. But by and large, the Dutch policy has been quasi-legal and regulated at the retail level, but not wholesale. And what you see is that the levels of marijuana use in that country for young people and older people are significantly lower than they are in the United States. What you also see is that the percentage of young people in the Netherlands who go on to experiment with harder drugs, is less than they are in the United States. Why? Because as the Dutch will say, we separated the two markets. Right? Typically, drug dealers in the United States, there's a good survey on this by Craig Reinerman and some others have been published, show that drug dealers in the United States are much more likely to sell multiple drugs. In the Netherlands, pot's over here, other stuff's over there. So the Dutch policy has been quite successful in that regard, and now the Danes are beginning to look at it, the Spanish, others. You see this easing up on marijuana policy. So we see that's a model that can work. We see that what the Portuguese have done, right, with respect to decriminalizing all drug possession. 10 years ago, you heard Rick Steves speak about this last night, decriminalized all drug possession, right, decided to much more employ a public health model, shift resources from criminal justice to health. It wasn't just the decriminalization, it was a health approach as well. And what did they find? Drug use didn't drop. Drug use didn't jump. It kind of hovered. But what they did reduce was HIV, hepatitis C, arrests, incarceration. They saved money. By and large, they found that you could stop arresting people for possession of any drug for personal use, and you could stop drug testing them and throwing them in jail for dirty urine. And you know what? You'd have a healthy, saner, more cost-effective drug policy. Right? So that's another model that's out there. Then you have the things that, for example, the Swiss started to pioneer 20 years ago. They saw, the cops were chasing more and more junkies around town, and, they would catch them, throw them into a drug-free program, throw them into a jail, get them to do methadone, which methadone's the best approach for some drug-free is good. But they were still left with some thousands of junkies who were involved in crime and criminality and problems. And, in a policy initiated by local governments with the support of law enforcement and business, they said, let's try something new. What if we say to these, and I apologize for using the phrase junkies because it is an insulting term, but I'm using it for dramatic effect. They said, let's take these injecting heroin users and let's allow them to go to a clinic. Let's allow them to go to a clinic where they can get legal heroin from that clinic, can't take it home, go up to 3 times a day, and we'll give them health services, HIV medications, all this sort of stuff. And what they found is, in Switzerland, and then this was replicated in the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark and England and Spain and Canada. What they found is that when you allow people to go and get their heroin from a clinic like that, pharmaceutical heroin produced by a company, that people's health improved, their HIV and Hep C risk behavior declined, arrests dropped. They actually reduced their use of other illegal drugs because they pulled back from the illegal drug markets, right? Some of them reunited with their families. Some of them got part-time work. And a significant minority of them actually said, well, wait a second. I don't want to come to a clinic 1, 2, 3 times a day. What am I doing here? And they began to realize, for the first time ever, they actually looked in the mirror and said, this is not about the heroin. This was about a lifestyle I had chosen. I don't need this. And 20% of them, it became drug-free. And a whole bunch of others shifted into methadone maintenance programs and finally made it work for them. And what they realized was the thing was more about the chase than about the drug itself. Now, these policies have been amply evaluated. You look at the results in the Journal of American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, the leading European journals. The stuff I'm telling you about is all amply documented in the scientific literature. Right? One of the tragedies of the United States is that you have these innovative European policies, but essentially our government won't spend a penny on looking at this stuff. There's still a kind of, trying to study these issues in the United States is a little bit like trying, it's like trying to do interesting social science research in the old Soviet Union. There's just certain questions that you're not supposed to ask, never mind seek funding for. And if you do ask them, it raises eyebrows that you don't want to have raised. And it makes it less likely that you're going to have access or influence to government funding and sources and all this sort of stuff. And there's a way in which sort of political blinders that operate in this world in the United States become intellectual blinders, where people just stop even asking the interesting questions. So what I think we need to do is move the drug policy down this spectrum over here. And here's what I'm fighting for. What I'm fighting for and what Drug Policy Alliance is fighting for is to move both the debate over drug policy and the policies themselves from the policies right now are over here. The debate is either over here about, as far as I say, moving the chairs around the Titanic of drug prohibition, or it's the ping pong legalization thing. The really meaningful debate is going to be when we get over here. We know, based upon all the available science and evidence and history and everything, that the optimal drug policy is going to be over here. And by over here, what I mean is someplace between Milton Friedman's vision, right, of the free market but regulated, and over here, which is a prohibitionist model but embedded in the principles of decriminalization, public health, human rights, what have you. Right? The Drug Policy Alliance, my organization, leading organization in the country, really the world, the people advocating for alternative drug policy, what we represent is this spectrum over here. Our membership ranges from conservative, libertarian, legalize everything, to people who are uncomfortable with legalizing anything, except maybe marijuana, but who want to reduce incarceration, treat addiction as a health issue, treat the whole thing in a more sensible, humane, kind of European-like fashion. I look forward to the day, right, when the membership of the Drug Policy Alliance reflects the mainstream of the United States. Increasingly, we're heading that direction. I look forward to the day when all of my allies, when we can all take out our knives and fight with one another, because the fights among ourselves between the prohibitionist harm reduction model and the legalization regulatory model are the really fundamental ones that really matter to Congress and the state legislatures, right? So for now, John and I are going to mix it up over here, but I look forward in coming years and decades when what the debate looks like is over here, because we know ultimately the drug policy that best reduces the harms of drugs and the harms of prohibition. That's the most cost-effective, humane, protective of civilities and human rights. It's someplace over here, and that's where we need to go. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the James A. Baker III Institute of Public Policy for inviting me here, and specifically to Bill Martin for inviting me. And my good friend Ethan has already introduced himself to you. I want to dispel the notion, the rumor that's going around the room that Ethan has a elect Pat Robertson sticker on his car. You know, Pat Robertson for president 2012. It's not true, is it, Ethan? I mean, he admits to having a car. Okay, so far. Well, let me see if I can work this. I have some slides here to show you today because I thought it might be a little bit easier to make the counterpoint to some of what Ethan said. And I want to begin with to say that I don't disagree with everything Ethan has said. I disagree with some fundamental areas of the premise of the arguments, but I certainly don't agree with the issues of reducing the harms and reducing the problems that we have with the abuse of drugs. That's, I think, a universal concept that we can all accept. But I do quarrel somewhat with the concept of, or the premise of today's conference, in that the so-called drug war has failed, primarily because there really hasn't been a drug war, and we're going to look at some of the evidence of that. If I can figure out how to work this. I think I just turned it off. Bill?
Probably it's this way.
Great, okay. First, we're going to have a little pop quiz. We're in a university, we can do that. Where and when do you think the expression war on drugs actually originated? This is an interesting question. Do you think it was the League? Those of you raise your hand who think it was the League of Nations in 1925 that came up with the expression. Okay, we have a few people. Raise your hand if you think it was Richard M. Nixon in 1971. Wow, a lot of folks, okay. Raise your hand if you think it was the Washington Post in 1912. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it was in the 1961 Single Convention. Nobody? Okay, none of the above. Does anybody want to venture that as an answer? Ethan, none of the above. Okay. There we go. The actual answer is the Washington Post, 1912. Now, those of you who said League of Nations, you weren't that far off, because in the following the 1924-1925 meeting at the League of Nations of the Opium Commission, Elizabeth Washburn Wright, who was the American delegate plenipotentiary heading the American delegation to the Opium Commission, even though the United States was not a member of the League wanted us to be in the League so much that it provided tremendous deference to the American Observer Committee, and oftentimes followed the advice of the American Observer Committee. So Elizabeth Washburn Wright, when she returned from a meeting of the Opium Commission in Geneva in 1925, she was actually quoted in the New York Times as having said something like, "The world needs a war on drugs." So you're not that far off with the 1925 League of Nations. Richard M. Nixon is often credited with the expression. He really didn't say it. He said something very similar. He said, "We need a war on drug criminals. We need a war on crime." But the actual expression drug war or war on drugs, he probably said it somewhere along the line, maybe later on, but he didn't really originate or coin the phrase. And it's not in the UN 1961 convention, but it is in the Washington Post. And let's see where it appeared in the Washington Post. On May 26th, 1912, almost 100 years ago, the Washington Post had an editorial in which it said the lack of efficient federal laws are handicapping the war on drug habit in this country. And it was basically an editorial in support of pending legislation, which was in the House and Senate at the time, that would regulate drugs. And that bill actually failed, but 2 years later, when it was reintroduced, as it became actually the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. So the act eventually did pass, but this was from 1912 from the Washington Post. Now let's look at this war metaphor that we use so frequently. And just picking out a few of them from thin air. We begin with Herbert Hoover's War on Waste in the 1930s. That was when Herbert was a Secretary of Commerce at the time and declared a war on waste. And of course, some of us remember John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in the 1960s. And then, of course, we have Richard M. Nixon's. This was a real one, the War on Cancer in 1971, when he signed the National Cancer Act and began a long sort of road toward a lot of research on developing treatments and cures for cancer. We have Sir Elton John just last year declaring a war on AIDS. And of course, then we have George Carlin. I don't know if all of you probably know George Carlin. George Carlin is probably one of the greatest comedians we've ever produced in this country. Passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. But if you Google his name and war on homelessness, I guarantee you, if you're not rolling on the floor laughing after watching that little video for about 20 minutes, you're humorless, because it's a very, very funny thing. And George says that, whenever we don't like something in America, we declare a war on it. And then we leave it alone. We go away. We just forget about it. But bottom line is that we declare the war on it. One of my favorites was John Lindsay's War on Pigeons. John Lindsay was mayor of New York from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. And I don't know if you know City Hall in New York. It's a beautiful French Renaissance building and has a nice little esplanade in the front where they can hold functions and so forth. But it's in a park that's also home to about 437 billion pigeons. And in the evening, in the morning, people come down there, usually elderly, retired type folks come in with shopping bags full of food for the pigeons. And the pigeons sit all over these people. It's amazing. You see them sitting on their head and everything. Anyway, some years ago, when John Lindsay was mayor, he wanted to get rid of those pigeons. And so he declared, quote, a war on pigeons. The pigeons won, I have to tell you that. Most recently, New York has declared a war on trans fats. So if you like your French fries and your Wendy's and your McDonald's and so forth, if you go to New York, you can still get them, but they're not cooked in trans fats because they have a war on trans fats in New York. So my point of all of this really is just simply to say that these are metaphors, the whole concept of war. I know that Dr. Martin did reference some things, and it's true that we use martial expressions all the time when we say people are fighting cancer, or they're fighting this, or they're fighting overweight, or they're fighting whatever. So we have these expressions that we use, combating drug abuse. It's very difficult because they're linguistically required to explain what we're talking about. But I submit to you that they are not, quote unquote, true wars in the sense of war. If you want a war, go over to Afghanistan and see a war. But right now. Okay, so let's look at some of the public policy questions evoked by saying that there's no war here. First of all, to protect health and safety, does Congress have the power to pass laws regulating the production and commerce in drugs, or in guns, or explosives, or poisons, or you name it? They tried to do light bulbs, I think, recently. Later in this month, we're going to have oral arguments before the Supreme Court on whether or not national health care in the Commerce Clause is constitutional. So we'll have to see where Congress goes with some of this, but I think overall we probably would have to agree that they do have this authority, at least constitutionally. Do state legislatures have the power to pass laws permitting the medical use of marijuana? This is a little bit more problematic when you get into some of the technical issues, and we'll explain those in a second. Do state legislatures have the power to pass laws permitting the recreational use of marijuana? That's pretty much tied in with the second one. And then are we obliged as citizens of this country to obey these laws, whether we agree with them? And then what is that sort of social contract that we all agree, even if we disagree, that the umpire, the third call strike is legit, we're going to go home sad, our team lost, but hey, there's another day tomorrow. Well, the first obstacle we run into, of course, is the United States Constitution. And Article 6 of that Constitution that you can read on the screen. And not Amendment 6, but Article 6, a very important article, because it says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. And what basically that says is our treaties, our narcotic and drug treaties with the United Nations and so forth, are binding. They're the law of the land, and that the laws and the Constitution and the laws of the United States that are made in pursuance thereof are also supreme law of the land. The Federal Controlled Substances Act, which is the law that basically brings us all together today, Section 903 of that act, which oftentimes people don't refer very often to, is the application of state law. How does state law comport with the federal narcotics law or the Federal Controlled Substances Act? It says right in there that no provision of this subchapter, which would be the Controlled Substances Act, shall be construed as indicating an intent on the part of the Congress to occupy the field in which that provision operates, including criminal penalties, to the exclusion of any state law on the same subject matter, which would otherwise be within the authority of the state. Now, had Congress stopped right there, I don't think we would be here today. There wouldn't be any problems because we're basically talking about the states having the authority to do something. However, look at that contingent clause that ends it up. Unless there is a positive conflict between that provision of the subchapter and that state law, so that the two cannot consistently stand together. Here's where we run into a problem with the state laws versus the federal laws. Now, where we bring all of this together is in a case, a very famous case in 2005 called Gonzalez versus Raich. This is a brief synopsis of the case. Many of you are probably already familiar with it. This is taken directly from the Westlaw abstract on the case. It's not something I made up. But it basically is it's amazing how such a relatively insignificant case involving only 6 marijuana plants winds up changing or at least establishing a landmark Supreme Court decision on the issues. In Gonzalez versus Raich, the actual core of the respondent's argument was not to contest the Controlled Substances Act. In fact, they stipulated to most of the conditions of the Controlled Substances Act. Their issue was that the federal government did not have a right, in a sense, to control something that was completely intra-state, occurred inside the state of California, inasmuch as the state of California had approved it. There was no interstate commerce, there was no movement of drugs in or out of the state and so forth. How does the federal government declare that it has venue in this type of a case? In a 6-3 decision, Supreme Court held that Congress's Commerce Clause authority includes the power to prohibit the local cultivation and use of marijuana in compliance with California law. And Justice Stevens delivered the opinion, and as you can see by the final bullet on this slide, it was the liberal wing of the Supreme Court that found that it was constitutional to ban the use of medical marijuana in California, that it was a constitutional prerogative under the Commerce Clause of the federal government. Now, there's a lot of propaganda that you're going to hear probably today, and you probably will hear again in the future, and you've probably heard again, or you've probably heard already in the past. You'll hear things like more than 1,000 dispensaries provide medical marijuana, and they're well-regulated and pay substantial taxes. Somebody wrote that in New York Times in 2011. Of course, a couple years before that, the Los Angeles County District Attorney, Steve Cooley, said that all the medical marijuana dispensaries in the county, and they have about 800, were operating illegally. They were accepting cash over the counter for pot, and it's very simple. That's prohibited by Prop 215 and the laws of California. And so he said that they were operating illegally and that they're going to be prosecuted. Then you will hear that there are 800,000 marijuana arrests each year, 50 to 100,000 people behind bars on any given night for marijuana. Of course, they're let go in the day. They don't tell you that. Say, no, not really. Actually, in 1997, there's very little data on this, and that's another thing, and we'll get into that in a second as well. When you do the research on these kinds of things, you find that there's an incredible paucity of data. It just doesn't exist, good data. You can find selective data, biased data, and so forth that support or refute your hypothesis, but basically there's very little sound, irrefutable, factual data. But anyway, the Rand Corporation in 2004 did undertake a study and find that the actual amount of people incarcerated for marijuana only is very, very small. Now, some of these studies in the past have looked at, have gone into the prisons, and they've looked at the people that have been in prisons, what they're in there for, and they conclude that that's what the crimes were that they committed. Well, about 95 to almost 98% of drug cases are pled out, which means there's a negotiated plea somewhere along the line. And so oftentimes they will drop more serious charges and allow the individual to plead guilty, say, to a possession of marijuana charge, and that then becomes the charge in the writ of commitment. Well, if that's all you're studying and you're not looking at the earlier charges, you're only getting a fraction of the real fact here. Portugal. We heard Ethan, my friend, talk about Portugal this morning. Portugal is a very interesting case because Portugal epitomizes what I said before about the lack of good data here. Portugal in 2001 decriminalized the use, acquisition, and possession of all illicit drugs for personal use. Well, we had one writer, Glenn Greenwald, wrote a book calling it a resounding success. We had another writer, Manuel Pinto Coelho, who, by the way, in interest of disclosure, is a member of Drug Watch International, but he wrote also that it was a disastrous failure. Well, a study team from Australia went over to Portugal to actually study whether or not each one of these studies or each one of these reports was true or false. And what they found was actually a lot of what both writers were saying was actually true in the sense that they said it based on the selective use of the evidence that they cited. But again, here's what the conclusion, one of the conclusions was: the Portuguese reform warrants neither the praise nor the condemnation of being a, quote, resounding success or, quote, a disastrous failure, and that these divergent policy conclusions were derived from selective use of the evidence base. Now, we in this country have really seriously bad data systems for telling us how many people are harmed or injured or killed as a result of drug abuse. The best we can tell you is from the CDC, and the CDC uses death certificates. But we know from some recent tragedies, in fact, that the toxicology screens and a post-mortem examination of a decedent does not come back. They do not come back, sometimes for 6 to 8 weeks. And that certificate has to be issued so the next of kin can have the body and bury the victim and so forth. And so oftentimes the death certificate goes in with unknown causes for death, and yet later on it comes back that it was drugs. So death certificate analysis is not a good way of telling us how many people die every year in this country from overdoses of drugs, but that's the best that we have. So we're not alone in the world in having bad systems. Portugal doesn't have a very good system. It didn't have a very good system when these people did their research. In fact, it wasn't until November of 2010 that Portugal actually adopted a regulation requiring that every suspected drug-related overdose death be autopsied. So that means that any statements made on the basis of whatever before that were speculative because they were based on reports, perhaps in the media or elsewhere, or specific areas of the country on how many people were dying of drug abuse, but nobody really could put their finger on it. So be very cautious of the data. Drug legalization, here we talked about the 1914 Act. That really created a legal construct for a lot of the drugs, and unfortunately many of those drugs today are actually causing, as it says here, today despite sophisticated regulatory schema, the legal drugs in this country cause more overdeaths each year than illegal drugs, including heroin and cocaine, even combined with that. And you can throw in a bunch of other drugs, and it's still, the legal drugs are still doing in more Americans every year. Now, when I talk to my good friends in the pro-legalization movements, they will concede that there's a need to keep these drugs, these street drugs, away from criminals and children and mentally impaired and so forth. And so we would have to sort of reconstruct another sort of schema, so perhaps somewhere along what we already have for the legal drugs. Well, if we did that, my final research question to you would be, how successful would we be in designing a program to ensure the safe use of legalized street drugs if we have thus far been unable to restrict access to already legal drugs? They're now being misused at higher rates than street drugs. And believe me, if anybody wants to talk about this later, I can give you a synopsis of the controls that the DEA has and so forth on the legal drug market. It's amazing. From point of manufacture to point of dispensing, those drugs are very tightly controlled. And if we have not been able to successfully control them or keep them away from people who would abuse them, it's doubtful we would be able to have better luck by legalizing them. So some final thoughts here. Do your own non-selective and unbiased research. Don't believe everything you hear or read. Just because something's published doesn't make it true. Healthy drug-free living is really worth the effort. Be skeptical of information from well-funded advocacy groups looking to convince you. And the drug war has not failed. The drug abuse, what we call the drug war, the drug abuse rates in America today are far below what they were in the 1970s and 1980s. The current violence in Mexico is the result of historically lax drug laws in that nation. They had de facto legalization in Mexico since I can remember, because never anybody went to jail down there. The cases that were made in Mexico usually resulted in large seizures, but very few people went to jail, and those who went to jail were granted in what they called indulgences or something in Mexico, indultos by the courts, or they bribed their way out. And so really there was very lax drug law enforcement in that country. Preserving law and order actually prevents the anarchy that we see in places like Mexico. And the logical and sequential consequence of anarchy is always tyranny. That's when the bad guys move in and take over. Poisoning more Americans by legalizing drugs in this country in return for perhaps less violence in Mexico is a very dubious and senseless proposition. And I thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing this further. Thank you, Bill. You sit over there and I'll sit here.
Okay. I think we'll let you, since John just finished, Ethan, why don't you respond, and then you can ask each other questions.
Yeah, I mean, John, that was a nice history lesson. Thank you. I didn't know that about the Washington Post in 1912. Well,
it's like yesterday.
It's interesting because I think just on a few points. I think what you downplay in all this, right, is in fact the very real costs of America's drug policies, whether we call it a war on drugs or not. And that, a policy where we lock up more people in America for a drug law violation than all of Western Europe locks up for everything, and they have 100 million more people than we do, even though the rates of drug use aren't that different than ours, really. The rates of nonviolent crime are not different. That is a real cost. I mean, millions of Americans living with a drug felony conviction, most of them not involved in violent crime so far as we know. Yeah. Those are very, 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 very real costs. I think on a few of the other points there, Portugal, I mean, the really interesting thing about Portugal, Alex Stevens, who will speak later, makes a very nuanced interpretation of data there, but the really bigger point there is that they decriminalized possession of all drugs, and they don't drug test people and throw them back in jail or prison, and the sky didn't fall. They didn't have some explosion of drug use. Basically, things may not have been dramatically greater, but I mean, that was really quite significant there. And I think that, when you talk about the, so they always throw that Rand slide about there's nobody behind bars for marijuana, but notice what they say is in state prison, right? So roughly 2/3 of the people behind bars are in state prison, but they're not looking at the federal prison stats where the numbers are higher. They're not looking at the people in jail, local jails, which have 750,000 people, and many of them are spending nights for marijuana charges, days, weeks, or months. And what they're also not looking at is all the people who are, the parole and probation violations. Over 5 million people under the supervision of parole and probation. And there is no good data, right? I agree with you on that, about how many of them are there because they had a dirty urine for marijuana. But all of the anecdotal reports you get from people working the system that's a substantial number. And they're spending time behind bars. They're just not listed as marijuana offenders.
Can I address this?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think inherently we sort of have a consensus here that, being in jail for drugs is not a nice thing, not a good thing, and certainly not something to be proud of in terms of our society, in terms of the number of people we have behind bars. But again, I'm not sure that legalizing drugs is the answer to that problem. We need to actually analyze it a little bit deeper. Number one, the United States is the largest importer of drug crimes in the world. People in places like Mexico or Colombia or Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, you name it, Afghanistan, Europe, etc. They're not looking to smuggle drugs to, Tasmania. And there's a reason why the U.S. represents such a lucrative market for smuggling drugs. It's because there's a lot of surplus money. We're a very wealthy country, and we have the money to spend on drugs. And so a lot of those drug crimes that we talk about are really imported crimes. And most of these people, many of them anyway, would not have been incarcerated in their home countries, even if they were caught with the drugs before they left those countries. That's one of the problems we deal with. About 1/3 of all federal prisoners 1/3, well, it's a little bit less, maybe 32%, of all federal prisoners, according to the Bureau of Prisons, are not United States citizens. We don't know what the state figures are because, again, the data are very lacking in this area, but it's reasonable to assume they're at least the same as the federal level, if not more. So if we removed or took out of our equation of number of people incarcerated in this country, those who are illegal aliens or not citizens of this country, we probably would have incarceration rates that are somewhat more in keeping with the global national or averages or whatever you might want to call them. The other thing is we have a completely different legal system than what exists in Europe. Europe, for the most part, is under what's called the Napoleonic Code laws, which substantially changes the picture when it comes to prosecuting drug cases. Yes, you are right. It is illegal in many countries in Europe to be, for example, a drug addict. It's not illegal in the United States to be a drug addict. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that that was a status crime. You couldn't lock somebody up simply because they're a prostitute or because they're a drug addict or because they're a vagrant. You actually had to catch them committing some sort of a crime. Some may say that that's a difference without a distinction because how can you be a drug addict without possessing the drugs? And the possession, of course, is the crime. But that's a significant difference between us and most of Europe and South America where they're still under the Napoleonic Code.
Well, John, I just, you focused in the end, your last line where I thought was a bit over the top, poisoning Americans by legalizing drugs to maybe reduce violence. I thought that kind of gave away your Drug Watch International credentials right there. I mean, I think what's really going on right now in a serious way is the discussion over legalizing marijuana, right? We now have, some people have seen the Gallup polls back in 2006. Gallup's been asking the same question for 40 years. Do you support legalizing marijuana use? 2006, it hit an all-time high of 36% in favor and 60% against, right? Same question asked last November, just 5 years later, 2006, 2011. That 36% in favor had become 50% in favor. The 60% against had become 46% against. 14-point jump in favor, 14-point decline on the going down, 28-point swing points shift. Bigger transition in public opinion in the last 5 years than we've seen on gay marriage in America, right? So you're seeing a major transformation. These ballot initiatives in Washington, Colorado, they're actually ahead in the polls. It's still an uphill battle because people get nervous at the end. And when we're talking about legalization, the real conversation around legalization that's emerging now is around marijuana, right? That does account for something like, nobody knows for sure, but 20 or 30% of the Mexican drug gangsters' money. The drug czar's office used to say it was over 50%, but I don't think that can't be right. California, 3 years ago, people were saying, you'll never legalize it. You got to last October in 2010, and people saying, how come it didn't win? Or November, right? You see it's definitely moving in that direction. Now, the question is, if in fact we do legalize marijuana, what in fact will happen? Well, it seems to me, will there be more people using marijuana? Probably. The price will come down, right? It'll be more readily available. So that will be a problem and a risk. I surely hope we don't see a Marlboroization or Budweiserization of marijuana. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is marijuana is already widely available in American society. Many people simply don't like it. Lots of people try it, don't like it. I also think, we always say that the war on drugs is basically about the kids, but let's face it, the one group we have to worry about the least with marijuana legalization is the kids, because the kids are the ones who have the best access to marijuana already. Even as marijuana use has gone up and down over the last 30 years, kids routinely say it's easy to get. There are 3 national surveys in which high school juniors and seniors say it's easier to buy marijuana than it is to buy alcohol. So quite frankly, we might see legalization lead to more people like you, John, or me, or people in their 70s. But lots of people in the 80s and 90s might find it's good for their arthritis or something and abandon all those pharmaceutical drugs that, as you pointed out, are killing them, right? But quite frankly, the notion that we could save 10 or 20 billion dollars a year in enforcement thing and bring in 5, 10, 20 billion and stop arresting 800,000 people a year and give them criminal records and drain the money from the criminals down in Mexico. I'm not saying this is nirvana or anything. I'm just saying it looks like a much more pragmatic, sensible policy, whether you're a liberal or conservative, than the current marijuana policy.
It seems like we have a very well-balanced audience here today. Thank you for your support. You know, I look around the room and I see a few people like myself with a little snow on the roof, so I'm able to probably say a little bit more about the history lesson here that I was ridiculed about before. But the bottom line is that, the issue about, you're right, the issue is mostly about marijuana today, and there are some changing attitudes on it, but I think we still need to look at some solid data sources. I don't think we can jump into this thing because, back in the 50s and 60s, there was a good deal of concern that smoking tobacco was probably not good, not healthy. But then we had, the tobacco companies came out with the ads with the doctors that more doctors smoke Camels or whatever than other cigarettes, and not a cough in a car full. You remember all those crazy ads with when they first came out with the menthol, that this was supposed to stop, people from having coughs and sore throats and everything else. It was absolutely ludicrous. And they would hire these doctors to, make these advertisements on TV and in the magazine ads and so forth. Well, a lot of folks knew that there was a connection, but we just didn't have the data. We didn't have the science and technology to be able to show the actual connection between the carcinogens in the tobacco smoke and the outcome of cancer in the lungs. And nowadays, of course, we have that, and so we're able to say that, and that's why we're able to take such a hard stand against tobacco. And rightfully so. You're absolutely right. However, we're about now where we were in the 50s with tobacco. We're about there now in terms of marijuana. We know that there is some sort of a mysterious relationship between marijuana and some of these other drugs. We know that a lot of these people that get in trouble with these drugs will also tell you that they started with alcohol and marijuana. And we're not saying it's a gateway. Please don't misunderstand. We don't have the evidence for that. However, there is a suspicion, and until we can abate that suspicion, I think we, at least as reasonable adults, need to be somewhat skeptical of the conclusion that marijuana is a harmless drug and it can be just sold to everybody over the counter, et cetera, and we won't suffer any consequences. A few years ago, I was asked to do a study in Dallas, and it was a study of heroin overdose deaths, and we obtained 425 autopsy reports of every heroin-related death occurring in the city of Dallas from 2002 until July of 2007. And part of my team was, for those of you who are local folks, Jane Maxwell from the University of Texas up at Austin, who's sort of like the state epidemiologist for drug abuse matters. We had Bruce Goldberg, who's head of the Florida Medical Examiners Commission. And he's a pathologist and a medical examiner himself. These were people that we had looking at the data. And so in our conclusions, when we refined our sample, we got down to 369 cases. We found that almost 1 out of 4 of those cases involving young people, particularly young people that we looked at, but 1 out of 4 cases of the 369 drug-related overdose heroin deaths, cannabis was found in the tox screen. Now, I'm not saying it was a causative agent. I'm not saying anything like that, but it certainly did contribute. And how it contributed, we don't know. We just have to be careful here. Interestingly, the Dallas Morning, let me just finish this a second. Interesting, the Dallas Morning News did interview some of the parents of the decedents, the young people, and I'll never forget the statement from one mother about her 17-year-old son. I knew he was drinking beer, and I knew he was smoking pot with his friends, but I never thought he was into heroin. Now, when a parent has to bury a 17-year-old child and say that, I think the rest of us should listen. I mean, let's give it some thought. Don't just joke and laugh it off and say it's not true.
What's really telling now is that there's a wonderful organization called Mothers United Against the War on Drugs now that's emerged, Gretchen Bergman, a range of others. And you see similar groups in Australia, Canada, elsewhere. And these are parents whose children are struggling with serious drug addiction, some of whom have lost their kids to drug overdoses or drug-related crime. Joyce Strickland's here from Dallas, who's started Mothers Against Teen Violence there. And what you see are parents and family members who have seen the absolute worst that drugs can do. Who have had children with, you could just see that addictive gene from day one, or whatever you want to call it. And what they are concluding is that the war on drugs has not been their ally. that the war on drugs did not protect their children from drugs. It did not save them. In fact, if anything, it made it more likely that they were going to get hurt and more likely that they were going to die. It meant that when they got into drugs, they were going to land up going to the black market. They were going to get involved in criminality and with unsavory characters. It meant that the drugs that they used were going to be unregulated and that there wasn't going to be accurate information. It meant they were going to use the drugs in secretive and degrading situations. It meant that they were going to be engaged with, that there would be drug-related violence, especially if they lived in poorer communities. So you're seeing more and more people who have seen just how terrible drugs can be, and they're saying, no thank you to the war on drugs. What they understand is there's nothing their government can really do to protect a child, to protect a loved one from drugs or from addiction when it comes to using police and prisons. That protection has to come from someplace else. But for those tens of millions, huge numbers of people who do get involved with drugs, most don't have a problem. But for those who do, the criminal justice system, for every one person who says, thank God they sent me to jail, that got me clean and now I'm good, there's another 5, 10, or 20 for whom it really pushed them further into the gutter and oftentimes to death.
Well, I'm not offering that the government is the absolute, thank you again. But hold on, let me finish.
Actually, John,
I know you're eager to clap for me, but.
And John, that was not from the people with a little snow on top, that was from the people with nothing on top.
He wishes he had some snow. Anyway, I'm not here to, advocate on behalf of the government. I mean, if you really want to know the facts about that, I've been probably the biggest critic of the government's programs. And my friend Kevin, who used to work over at the Drug Czar's office a few years ago, understands that I was quite critical of that function as well as the other functions of the government. I'm even critical of some of the DEA operations at times, but I'm critical from a positive standpoint. It's constructive criticism. I'm trying to improve rather than just disassemble the whole apparatus. And I do think that when it comes to certain things to protect public health and public safety, we do have to agree that the government has a role to play. We just can't ignore it. And yes, you're right. The government didn't save those young people, but we will never be able to say how many, it's like, what was it, Emerson said, we'll never know, no one on earth will ever know how many prayers God has answered. Think about that for a second. You can never prove a negative here. You can never say, for example, that, well, we don't know how many people the government actually saved from that fate, but we do know that the efforts of the government and the efforts of the private sector and the parents' organizations and organizations around the world do make a difference. The education and prevention efforts do make a difference. I mean, we believe it. We have to believe it. And I do think that overall, it's better to have something than nothing. And with nothing, we would just simply have more of the tragedies, it seems to me. Can we improve? Yes, of course we can improve. And I think that's something where, regardless of whether you support my position or Ethan's position on all of this, I think we can all agree that we need to improve. And improvement certainly is something we can all work together for. But just simply to tear something down, it sort of reminds me of something that Mike Dukakis said in the 1988 presidential election. Any jackass can tear down a house. It takes a real architect with some skills to build one.
Yeah, and I just want to say in concluding that I think what
they're trying to kill me.
Yeah. I just and John and I may disagree on the objective here to some extent, but on the process and the challenge ahead, I think we'll probably agree. Which is, I basically see what's going on now, whether we're talking about the struggle over marijuana legalization in the United States, or whether we're talking about the proposals that are emanating now from Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, that are looking for alternatives to the global prohibition system. I mean, I think we're at a moment in the year 2012 when we're essentially right in the middle of what's looking to be the evolution from the failed global prohibition regime of the 20th century to a new 21st century global drug control regime that's much more grounded in science, health, compassion, and human rights. That's the evolution. That's the broader historical process. This is a multi-generational struggle. We built up this prohibitionist mechanism in the U.S. around the world for a century. Now it's going a new direction. And it's not about a free market. It's not about let everything fly. It's about a sensible, intelligent regulatory policy. Now, I think, though, and this is, I think, where we're going to agree, is that, in fact, the hardest tensions that are going to result are going to be in the United States with marijuana reform. From my perspective as an advocate for these reforms, managing the struggle and the tension between the changes in state law and policy and the federal resistance, that is the preeminent challenge with medical marijuana and ultimately with marijuana legalization. And managing that intelligently, thoughtfully, is going to be the major challenge. How one does that in an unruly, growing movement is going to be tough. And ditto for what the Otto Perez Molina, the president of Guatemala, is recommending, and other people in Santos and others from Colombia, how they manage that transition, trying to begin to pop holes in a prohibitionist framework while we have the international conventions. John did a very nice job of laying out that conflict between the systems. Managing that from an advocacy perspective is our number one challenge in the years and decades to come. Thank you.
Right. Thank you both so much. Thank you both, Ethan and John, for a very lively, as I predicted, and gentlemanly civil discussion, the very sort we like to foster here at the Baker Institute. We're going to, our next